This week is Senior Bowl week. We are going to hear analysis and over-analysis of over 100 prospects competing in Mobile, Alabama. Today, though, I'm going to give you three types of prospects I have my eyes on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, January 31st, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, a lot of people think that the week off between Conference Championship Sunday and Super Bowl Sunday is a week that's quiet in the NFL, but that's not true because this week the teams are gathered in Mobile, Alabama for the Senior Bowl. It's one of the college all-star games. In fact, it's become the most prestigious college all-star game. It was not always that way. There used to be prospects going to all sorts of games, but these are the top prospects, or at least the players who are generally considered the top prospects. There are other all-star games out there with draft prospects, but the best of the best are invited to the Senior Bowl, and that's where teams are scouting these players. It's viewed as a very important week. In fact, kind of oddly, and this is something you hear a lot in the scouting community, it's something you hear a lot in the media, there are a lot of people who will tell you that the practices leading up to the game are viewed as more important than the game itself, and it's a very interesting dynamic because normally you would never hear that a practice is more important than a game, but that's the way a lot of teams view these practices. It's the way a lot of people in the media view things. Now this week you're going to hear a lot of narratives. I mean, I think every year at the Senior Bowl there are like 100 different players who people analyze, and there's always this conflicting. These conflicting stories about who did well and who did poorly, and there's so much emphasis put on like one practice rep, where guys one decent practice rep, and you see it all over social media, and it's like it helps the guy's draft stock out a lot. And I think we've gotten to the point where, not just with the Senior Bowl, with almost everything in the draft, people overanalyze this stuff. I mean, it is analyzed to death, and it's to the point where people need to relax a little bit. I think that some of the narratives that are going to come out of this week are kind of ridiculous. No, that's not to say they're irrelevant. I do think that there are some things that really matter with the Senior Bowl. Now, the first of which is teams get a chance to interview players. And you're going to hear stories about, this team was spotted interviewing this prospect. And it's a bit silly because teams ultimately interview almost every player they're interested in. Some of the players they'll get at the Senior Bowl, some of them they'll get at the Combine, some they'll get on Pro Day, they might get them an in-person visit. So in many cases, it's a matter of the timing of it. So just because you hear a team is interviewing a player, that doesn't mean that big of a deal. But the interviews matter. The fact that teams interviewing a certain player, that's not news. The contents of that interview can matter because there are some players who can either confirm team suspicions about them. They can make teams really not that interested in them, or they can show a team that they're the type of guy that they want. So the interviews matter, I think, from that standpoint. It's not the Jets are spotted chatting with this guy because you don't know how it's going. The Jets may be spotted chatting with some guy, and everybody's going to say, well, the Jets will draft him. And the guy may do terrible in the interview. It's more the contents of the interview. But I think what happens on the field over the next couple of days and what happens in the game on Saturday is significant for some players. Not for every player, but I think there are some players. And on today's show, I want to talk about some of the players, the types of players, and I'll give you an example of each category I list, so that way I'm not being super vague. There are plenty of players who fit into all of these categories this week, though. And the first is the small school prospects. And I think it should be fairly straightforward as to why this is an important week for the small school prospects. You always wonder a bit when somebody's dominating in a small school, is it a case of a big fish in a small pond? You can't really judge a guy who dominates on a lower level because you don't know if he's actually that good or if he's only dominating because he's so much better than the competition, just because the competition is generally not that good. Now, it's not necessarily fair to assume that every small school prospect is not going to be ready to compete against the NFL. There are plenty of examples of guys who came from small schools who have turned into excellent NFL players. This week doesn't tell us everything, but I think it's significant because it's a chance for them to step up in competition. You're no longer going up against guys who, frankly, will never even make an NFL practice squad. This week, if you are a prospect and you're at the Senior Bowl, you're going up against guys who are the best of the best. Now, not all the guys at the Senior Bowl this week are going to turn into good NFL players. In fact, some of these guys are probably not going to get drafted. Some of these guys won't make an NFL roster. Now, a lot of them will. But it's an opportunity to kind of put yourself on even footing, because the players who play in major conferences, if you play in a major conference, you may not be going up against NFL caliber competition every week, but odds are there's at least one player who you oppose on a weekly basis. If you're an offensive lineman, it'll be a defensive end, vice versa. If you're a wide receiver, it will be a corner, vice versa. If you're a quarterback, you'll play against NFL caliber players if you play in a major conference. Again, it may not happen every week, but if you're in the SEC, of course, you'll play Alabama, you'll play Georgia. You'll get some good tests out there. And if you're in another conference, you're in the ACC, you'll play Clemson, and of course across the league, and across all of these major conferences, there are players who will be in the NFL playing on Sundays. So the guys who play in the major conferences, they kind of get a test, frequently. The guys who play in smaller conferences, especially smaller school guys, not so much. Then this is their real opportunity to step up. Now, you never want to read too much into 1 week of practice, because again, I've seen through the years, I've seen some tweet of a video of some guy dominating show up on Senior Bowl week, and that guy never develops into a good player. It happens, but it's an opportunity if you're say a small school wide receiver to show what you can do against a corner who's going to be less of a mismatch than what you're used to facing. If you're a small school receiver and you're really fast and really tall, you can kind of dominate just on physical ability alone. You don't necessarily need good technique to win. Whereas when you go up against a guy who's more of an even match for you, you need to display your technique. You need to learn. And I think as much as anything, these guys have an opportunity to display how quickly they can learn. Because again, a lot of these small school guys, they don't come in with great technique. They come in and they dominate based on talent alone. Well, this week they're getting NFL caliber coaching. So they're going to have an opportunity to show how quickly they take to it and how quickly they can at least flash technique. Now, technique is typically not something that's instilled overnight, but you can flash it a little bit. You can show that you have the ability to do it, and you have the ability to show that you can play with the big boys this week. You're going up against a bigger school prospect, somebody who's projected to be drafted a little bit higher. And who's an example of that? Well, I'll give you a guy I kind of have my eye on, and that's Marte Mapu, who is from Sacramento State, which is an FCS school, so not the highest level of college football. He was actually in an All-Star game last week in the NFLPA Collegiate Bowl, and during the practices through the week, he was a guy who was impressing people. And interesting player. I've seen some people list him as a safety. I've seen some people list him as a linebacker. A guy who, in some ways, kind of fits the mold of what the Jets look for at the linebacker position. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying the Jets are necessarily going to draft all these guys, but I'm trying to find players who could fit the mold of somebody the Jets might be interested in drafting. And of course, you remember back in 2021, they, first of all, in that offseason, tried to sign Keanu Neal, who was a longtime NFL safety, and they wanted to convert him to linebacker. Well, in the NFL draft that year, on day 3, they drafted a pair of guys who were safeties in college who they converted to linebacker, and the idea is they want to get faster at linebacker. They want linebackers who are good cover guys. And, even if you're not a great cover safety, an average cover safety is a plus cover linebacker. It's easier, it's tougher to find cover guys at linebacker than it is at safety. So, and you've seen plenty of, through the years, if you watch the NFL, you've seen plenty of guys convert from safety to be successful linebackers. So this is the kind of guy who's, a bit of, I get the sense, a bit of a tweener who, could fill either spot. And this is the type of guy who could conceivably be somebody who's the Jets are interested in based on their scheme, based on the way they've handled the draft in the past at this position. So that's a guy who I think it'll be interesting to see how he matches up against premium draft competition. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue to talk about Senior Bowl week, what we should look for. There's another thing I have my eye on. It's guys who have been asked to take to a new position, because not everybody in college plays the position that's going to be best for them in the NFL. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail as we continue this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Blue Nile. Valentine's Day is coming up. It's just 2 weeks away, which means romance is in the air more than usual. And I do not need to tell all of you lovebirds that you've probably had your date plans on the calendar for weeks now. But have you found the perfect Valentine's gift yet? Whether you're celebrating this day of romance or whether you're ready to pop the question, you can find jewelry as unique as she is with the modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. At BlueNile.com, you can find the perfect piece of jewelry for life's special moments, or even create the custom engagement ring of her dreams. Their simple online tools let you choose the diamond shape, size, and clarity, as well as the setting style. Blue Nile's bench jewelers will then handcraft that perfect piece to your specifications. And Blue Nile provides expert guidance, in-depth educational materials, and unique online tools that place you in control, so you can forget the usual hassles of jewelry shopping process and focus on the romance. Blue Nile's diamond price guarantees allow you to compare a competitor's diamond against one of theirs. Blue Nile can even meet or beat their price, and every order is insured and arrives quickly in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shipping's for free, and so are returns. Right now you can save up to 50% at BlueNile.com. Again, that's BlueNile.com for up to 50% off. BlueNile.com. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. And you should know that Locked On is heading to the Senior Bowl. Get inside analysis from the hosts that covered the NFL's next generation in college, and find out which NFL draft boards these players will be climbing, all in one location. Subscribe to Locked On NFL Draft for nightly live shows from the Senior Bowl on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about the Senior Bowl. I'm telling you guys who I kind of have my eye on, different types of players in particular. We talked about smaller school prospects. Now I want to talk about guys who could be changing positions in the NFL. And if you ever want to know something that to me is like the football equivalent of nails on chalkboard, it's when somebody says, well, this guy played this position in college. How could you possibly ask him to change his position? Why don't we do something smart, like leaving him at the same position in college? I hate that, because not everybody in college plays the position that's the best fit for them in the NFL. First of all, there are some guys who just are not played in their optimum role in college. There are teams in college that will just put their best athlete on the offensive line at left tackle no matter what, even if that guy cannot handle the left tackle position in the NFL. But beyond that, I think it should be obvious that there are certain skill sets that fit better at certain positions. You may be fast enough to play corner in college. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to be fast enough to play corner in the NFL. However, you might have the tackling and ball skills and be fast enough to play safety in the NFL. Not really that crazy of a concept in my mind. Another example, we just talked about it. There's guys who move from safety to linebacker. Maybe they're not fast enough to play safety. Maybe they don't have the cover skills to play safety, but they have they have the speed and cover skills at linebacker. You don't need to be as fast at linebacker. You don't need to be as good of a cover guy. You just need to be able to tackle. You need to be able to play in the box, maybe be a little bit more physical. There's some of the position changes are a little more out there, and there are certain guys who convert from tight end to offensive line or offensive line to tight end. Occasionally, you'll have guys move from the defensive line into an offensive line role in the NFL. It occasionally works. That actually how the Jets, you may remember if you're a longtime Jets fan, there was a guy, great right guard, Brandon Moore, who was a defensive lineman in college who switched over to the offensive side in the NFL. Those are kind of reaches. I mean, there are other times like a quarterback moves to wide receiver. It usually doesn't work. Occasionally it does. You get a guy like a Brad Smith who plays a role really well. But on the offensive side of the ball, I think the most commonly successful one is when you change from one offensive line position to another. And kind of bringing it full circle, I was talking about this just a few minutes ago. Sometimes a guy plays left tackle in college, but he's better suited inside to play guard because maybe he doesn't have the functional athleticism to protect the edge, but he's strong enough on the inside to get a push against 300-pound tackles. So I don't understand when somebody looks at this and says, well, he played tackle in college, therefore it's crazy to trade him to guard in the NFL. Your skill set might be better for another position in the NFL. So looking across Senior Bowl week, it's going to be interesting to see how quickly certain guys take to certain positions. I think that's definitely something worth watching. And I'll give you an example. It's actually a guy who is an offensive lineman. He's from out of North Dakota State, Cody Mauch, who played tackle in college and, at least for the first day of Senior Bowl practice, played inside at the guard position. Now, I do think that there's an argument to be made. I think the better argument for a player like this is it's more difficult to find a tackle in the NFL than it is a guard. So you give the guy a shot to play tackle first, and if he fails there, then you think about moving him inside to guard. Now that's something that makes a little bit more sense to me. But you'll see this you'll see this through Senior Bowl week. You'll also see it at certain spots. In certain spots there are different positions within positions. Take wide receiver. There are outside receivers and slot receivers. There are certain guys who are who can play outside in college, but they're too small to make it in the NFL against bigger press corners. So they'll play the slot exclusively. So those are guys worth watching. But again, the guy for the Jets, because we know the Jets need an offensive lineman. We know the Jets need somebody who can play on the, they need help, frankly, at both guard and center. But Cody Mauch's going to be an interesting one because it'll be interesting to see how he takes to guard this week. But again, I don't know if you can completely rule him out at tackle. It's going to be something worth watching. Now, as we close out this episode of the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll give you one final type of player to keep an eye on. And it's the player who doesn't really blow you away athletically, but understands the nuances of his position. And I'll elaborate on that as we close out this Tuesday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's our new sports betting partner, and they are the #1 sportsbook in America. If you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. So download FanDuel now. You can bet Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You get up to $3,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. And FanDuel lets you bet on everything, from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. So join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Tuesday, we're talking about Senior Bowl week. It's a week that generates a lot of attention. Frankly, I think we've gotten to the point where maybe it generates a little bit too much attention, but that's not to say the results of this week are irrelevant. We've talked about two types of players I've got my eye on. I'm going to give you a third before we close out this episode. And that's, for lack of a better way to describe it, the guy who knows how to play. Maybe the guy who is not physically overwhelming, the guy that doesn't have blazing speed, the guy who's not gonna jump off the page at you when you watch him physically, but the guy who understands the nuances of his position. A year ago, and this is a little tricky because we haven't had the combine yet, because there could be guys who surprise you at the combine with their athleticism. A year ago, there were questions about Garrett Wilson's speed. Then Garrett Wilson got to the combine and ran in the 4.3 range in the 40-yard dash. But he would be a good example of somebody you might look at, because at the time, a lot of people did not realize he was going to run that fast. And he's not he's not an overly powerful receiver, but he's a guy who understood how to get open. He has some nuances in his route running. He's kind of an unconventional route runner. And these guys like this, they have a way of sticking in the NFL. Sometimes we go crazy about the guy who lights up the stopwatch, who just amazes you with their vertical jump. And you kind of have this idea in your head that if they could put it all together, they're going to be something special. And part of the reason they have an unlimited ceiling, I think, is because when the guy's not developed, you can let your imagination run wild with him. Whereas the guy who's got a more nuanced understanding of the technical aspects of his position, there's less to fill in. There's less room to grow. They're already closer to their ceiling, so maybe you don't go as crazy with them. But sometimes these are the best guys. Sometimes and frequently they turn out to be the best pros, because football is a game where speed matters. Football is a game where size matters. Football is a game where athletic ability, leaping ability matters, but only to an extent. There are certain skills at each position that you have to have. A pass rusher may not be the most explosive guy, but if he's got a bunch of good counters, if he's got a bunch of good moves, he might be able to make a living in the NFL, even if he's not a superstar. Good technique is important practically every position in this league. At corner, even at the quarterback position, the ability to read a defense is something that is frankly much more important than just raw arm strength in many cases. So it's important to remember that maybe some of the guys who don't look overwhelming physically can carve out a good living in this league. And I'll give you a guy who I've got my eye on this week, and he's a receiver from Purdue. His name is Charlie Jones. He's not expected to really light up the combine. I could be wrong on that, but I'm not expecting him to run a great 40-yard dash in the combine. And that's the type of that's the number one drill people look at the wide receiver position. But he's a very, in my view, a very refined route runner, a guy who understands the nuances, understands how to get open, and sometimes these are the guys who fly under the radar because everybody's obsessed with the physical, the physical guy, the guy who just has overwhelming physical abilities. And sometimes those guys make a highlight reel play this week, and sometimes they show you the most rudimentary thing where they add an extra route to their arsenal, and instead of 3 routes they can run 4 routes, and everybody goes crazy about it. Again, sometimes this stuff pans out, but in many cases it doesn't. In many cases, the guys who are the best pros, the guys who end up being the soundest picks, the guys who already know how to play, who enter the game with a refined skill set, with some nuance to their game, guys who don't necessarily need to be coached up as much, even if they don't necessarily have the highest ceiling out there. So that's one example. And these are guys who are going to fly under the radar. They may be day 2 picks, they may be day 3 picks, but in many cases they pan out. In many cases you don't regret picking them, even if they don't let you dream the way maybe a guy who's 6'4", runs a 4.3 40 do. The ability to run routes at the receiver position matters. The ability to show technique at practically every position, it can make a big difference when you can step in immediately and be able to contribute. Projects are projects for a reason. I think sometimes we view being a project as a point in your favor. You can draft a guy who doesn't really have any nuanced knowledge of his position, and you say he doesn't have a good first year. You say, well, he's a project. Well, being a project makes you less likely to succeed than somebody who understands the finer points of a given position. So something to keep in mind. Sometimes the best players at the Senior Bowl, the guys who turn out to be the best, aren't the guys who really light it up. They're just but they show an ability. They show that they can make it work against even elite competition, and that's the key. That's the thing I'm watching for. Because this week you're going up against the best prospects out there. And if you can succeed, even if you aren't the most overwhelming physical specimen, it might say something. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. Again, if you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow for our weekly mailbag.